Recording?
Yes, please.
Start recording. I just started.
Right. This is Marx School number 11 and the third Marx School in English. So far we had 11 Marx schools, 3 in English including this one in Tamil and 7 in Singular. Today we have Professor Achin Vanaik to talk about secularism, communalism and Indian politics today. Professor Achin Vanaik is a retired professor of international relations and former head of Department of Political Science at Delhi University. He's a lifelong activist in nuclear disarmament in India and in the world. And he's the founder of Society of Marxian Studies. Do you have it now even?
Yes. We are having two schools a year, one in the north of India and the other in the south.
Right. And he's a renowned Marxist academic and social scientist. His books include The Future of India, Communalism, Religion, Modernity and Secularism, brief history of rise of Hindu authoritarianism, secular claims, the
communal realities,
the painful transition, bourgeois democracy in India. I think that was probably your first book.
That's
which was
right.
published in 1970s, because I read it as a very young lecturer. Yeah. Then the recent books are After the Bomb, Reflection on India's Nuclear Journey, that was published in 2015. The Rise of Hindu Authoritarianism, Secular Claims and Communal Realities, that was 2017 Verso publication. And Nationalist Dangers, Secular Failings, a compass for an Indian Left, that was published in 2020, this year. So I will invite Professor Achin Vanaik to make his presentation. Our format is something like presentation 45 to 1 hour and then 1 hour discussion.
Okay.
So Professor Vanaik.
Thank you very much, Sumane. If I'm speaking too fast, please let me know. And I'm going to be talking while presenting these slides, part of it theoretical and the rest much more concrete in terms of what is happening in India. So let us start. The first opening slide, if you like, is Secularism, Communalism, and Indian Politics Today. Let me start with some definitions. If you look etymologically or historically, the word secular comes first. It's connected to the Latin word seculum, which meant the spirit of an age, or if you like, a great span of time. And incidentally, those of you who are into economics, you will recognize that this notion of secular exists even today. For example, when we talk about secular trends in the economy, a great span of time, okay? The second term that came in 1648, and that was the term secularization, which referred to the state's takeover of ecclesiastical lands. So secularization meant make more worldly. And secularism comes in the middle of the 19th century, after you have had the emergence of modernity, the scientific revolution, the emergence of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment values. Now these terms secular, secularization, which come before modernity, their understanding changes with the emergence of modernity itself. So why does this happen? And here we have to understand what is the difference, the fundamental difference between modernity and pre-modernity. And it can be summed up in a single sentence. When we talk of modernity, of course, capitalism is crucial to the emergence of modernity. When we talk of modernity, you're talking about a period when the rate, depth, scale, scope, and continuity of change is far, far greater than anything that takes place before the emergence of modernity. Those societies, if you like, are much more static. To put it another way, the world of human beings, the world over the last 250 years has changed much more than in all the centuries before. And in the last 50, 60 years, it's probably changed more than in the 200 years before that. Huh? So when we talk about secularism, we have to understand secularization. We have to understand this. Let's take the notion of secular first. In Christian discourse, it referred to a notion of time. You had sacred time and you had profane time or ordinary time. You had the God's time of eternity and you had ordinary time. And they were not parallel, but God's time of eternity intervened into ordinary time. What happens with modernity? The notion of time itself changes. You no longer have a cyclical notion of time or a seasonal notion of time related to the agricultural seasons, whatever. You begin to have a notion of time because change is taking place so fast. There's a new notion of progress. The notion of time itself changes. It becomes linear in one direction. It becomes empty. That is empty of God's or supernatural intervention. And third, it becomes homogeneous. That is to say, it is time is the same for everybody else. So 1 minute for you is the same as 1 minute for anybody else over here. So linear, empty, homogeneous. So you see that the notion of secular as time is changed here. Secularization. Secularization was an attempt to understand and to register religious change because everything changes in modernity, including religions of all kinds, in so many ways. And secularization was trying to understand what has changed in religion. And there are, I've said four notions. Let me take the first three. One, that there has been a decline as compared to the past. A decline in religious beliefs, a decline in religious institutions, a decline in religious power, and so on. And this is perfectly correct. Even if you talk about the resurgence of religion recently, it is not like in the past, when in fact religious authority had much greater control and influence. Now you have secular law related to economy. The much of culture is much wider now than older notions of culture. The economy has its own rules. Your laws are not the same as they were when they were strongly influenced by customary law or by religious law. The whole areas are different. So of course, you have decline. A second notion is what can be called compartmentalization, disengagement, differentiation. What this is saying is, yes, in modernity, religion becomes more compartmentalized. Earlier it was there everywhere, but now it's become more restricted. Still powerful, but there are areas in which it doesn't touch. Compartmentalization. And the third notion was the notion of rationalization. This is something that more and more people do not believe in the supernatural or do not give it the same importance as before, the idea of God's time intervening here. In fact, secularization also takes place within religion. Islam is supposed to be more secular than Catholicism. If you like, Protestantism is supposed to be a more secular a form of Christianity than Catholicism because it does away with magic, mystery, and miracle. So you have these three notions: compartmentalization, decline, and rationalization. India, however, and many Indians give a fourth definition or understanding of secularization. They don't see the difference between secular and secularization because secularization is a process. They see it as the same, and they say that India was always secular. You always had secularization in India. And here what they're trying to put forward as the meaning of secularization is tolerance, coexistence of different religious communities. India was always tolerant and it remains tolerant now. This, of course, is a very poor understanding of tolerance because in modernity, tolerance is very different from pre-modern tolerance because tolerance now gets connected to what is called a rights discourse, which did not exist in the past. Yeah? So, four different understandings here. Secularism, as the ISM should indicate to you, it comes with Holyoake and Bradlaugh. They first formulated it. It was related, it was seen as an ideology of morals. The difference in the modern time and pre-modern is that now people are saying, and this is what secularism was meant, is that yes, we talk about morality, but now morality should be concerned with the good of human beings in this world. This is what is most important. Now, throughout history, humans have always asked themselves, what is good? What is bad? How am I to live? Secularism, which came in the wake of the scientific revolution, talks about concentrating on human beings in this life, separate from God's transcendent notion here. That becomes a notion, how am I to live in this world? And a subset of this question, how am I to live in this world, becomes, how am I to live politically? And this becomes the question of the state, which is the most important political unit everywhere. So then you begin to have a connection between secular and the state. Okay? What is this connection? What do we mean when we say a secular state? It means three things. It means it is not the job of the state to help you or its citizens to reach salvation. Second, a secular state is one which does not come under the control of religious personnel and institutions. And third, minimum, is that all its citizens, equally, irrespective, there is equality of citizenship, at least with regard to the question of religious affiliation. Regardless of religious affiliation, you are equally citizens. This notion of secularism is connected to the notion of democracy. It's important to understand that secular means a separation, a basic separation between the state and religion. I say basic secularization because there is some area in which you will also find religion intervening in the state and so on, coming here, but it should be separate from the control, yeah, and equally here. It does not mean separation of all religion from politics, because outside of the state there will be politics, and you cannot stop religious groups from also mobilizing and saying something here. So, for example, you've had Christian democracy, you have religious groups who want to fight for abortion in the United States, and so on. So it's a state, basic separation, yes. But in society, what are we saying? Society, what are we saying? We are saying that secularism does not mean the elimination of religion in society. It means the establishing the terms of coexistence between the secular and the religious, and those terms of coexistence will be much more modest than in the past. So we have secular, secularization, secularism, the question of state and coexistence, okay, terms of coexistence. Now it has been my argument that we have to pay attention not only to maintaining a secular state and strengthening its secularity, but also talk about secularization of society. But before I do that, let me come to what is called religio-political movements. Okay. Now, what are your religio-political movements? One category are religious fundamentalisms. But please note that religious fundamentalisms are not necessarily political. There is a small section of religious fundamentalisms that turn inwards. Think of the Amish. Think of certain tantric cults. They are not so much concerned with the state and power and political issue, but they turn inwards. However, you have all kinds of religious fundamentalisms which are very much political. They are fundamentalists in terms of turning to their text or whatever, and they are fundamentalists. Okay? Then you have religious nationalisms. All religious nationalisms will be against secularists, but not all religious nationalisms will necessarily be against other religions. So, for example, Iran is not against Christianity, but certainly against secularists. Okay? Communalism, a simple definition of communalism, which takes place in multi-religious, in religiously plural societies, right? And can you see the PPT?
No.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Now, communalism, if I were to define it, would be something like this. Communalism is the sharpest expression in a religiously plural society of the failure to maintain a proper balance between the secular and the religious, which allows for the emergence of unwarranted hostilities for political and other purposes, right? And of course, you can have majority communalism and you can have minority communalism, and we have to fight against both. So in Sri Lanka, you will have what we could call Buddhist revanchism or Buddhist communalism, but you can also have Islamic fundamentalism. We have to fight against both. But having said that we have to fight against both, we cannot say that both have the same danger. Majority communalism is more dangerous. Why is this? When we talk about minority communalism, the ultimate logic of minority communalism is separation. In India, Islamic communalism fundamental, Pakistan. Sikh communalism, Khalistan, right? But majority communalism can do what minority communalism cannot do. It can disguise itself as a nationalism. And because it can disguise itself as a broader nationalism, its capacity to change the whole of society is much greater. In that respect, it represents a very important difference, minority. I mentioned about the connection between secularism and democracy, right? Before I come to this second slide, secularism, the secular state, is the necessary but not sufficient condition for democracy. How is that the case? I said equal rights regardless of religious affiliation. But those equal rights may not be democratic. So the Soviet Union was secular but not democratic. Kemal Atatürk's Turkey was secular but not democratic. So you can have a secularity which is not democratic, a secular state which is not, but you cannot have a democratic state which, at least in a minimal sense, has to be secular. And this is important here. And then when we talk about variance among secular states, you will see as gets connected to questions of democracy and so on. But let me come to my next slide. Please note that what has happened in Sri Lanka and what has happened in India, Buddhist revanchism, Buddhist nationalism, Hindu nationalism, so on, is part of a global phenomenon of the rise of right-wing and far-right authoritarian populisms. Now, since it is part of a global trend, your first principle of explanation has also to be global, right? When did this start? Why did it start? And please note that you will find that the trend towards these kinds of authoritarian populisms of different kinds really starts from the late 70s, early 80s onwards. It's really there that they begin to start slowly everywhere. And then, of course, it's been accelerated, especially after the Great Recession of 2008, 2012. But it took place from the 80s. What happened from the 80s? You have the emergence and spread of a neoliberal form of capitalism, which is the most miserly and terrible forms of even capitalism, breaking away from the developmental state in most countries of the South and breaking away from Keynesian welfarism in the advanced countries. You have neoliberalism, with which comes greater inequalities, all kinds of other problems here. Neoliberal globalization creating here. And you have, as a result of this, and also other four factors, you begin to see the limits of liberal democracy. You have greater ideological disarray, especially as socialism and communism loses its appeal more widely. And you also have psychic dislocation. What do I mean by that? Actually, Frederick Jameson put it very well. When you have greater globalization, what happens is the kind of forces that act on people's lives and shape them are no longer comprehensible by the ordinary existence or lived experience of a particular person. 500 years ago, the life of an ordinary person was within 15, 20 kilometer radius. That was the life. They could at least understand what is here. With the capitalist development, with globalization of all kinds of forces and so on, your capacity to even understand why what is happening to you is happening becomes much, much more difficult, and leading to all kinds of psychic dislocation, whereby you try to cling on to those identities which are given, which cannot change. Your religion, your family, the nation in which you are born. All of these things become something that you cling on to give you this say here. Remember, I said that the global rise of the far right came from the late 70s, early 80s. It gave rise to what I call the politics of cultural exclusivism, which has had four forms. One, the rise of anti-immigrant and racist xenophobia. This took place from the 80s onwards in the advanced countries, in Europe and the United States. It's much more accelerated now. In those times, it wasn't Islamophobia. Now, of course, it's connected to Islam. It was anti-immigrant. You had racism based on color, right? Much more there. You also had, that's in the first world. You also had the irredentist nationalisms. By the 90s, you began to have the breakup of the Soviet Union and of Yugoslavia, and so on. Irredentist nationalisms. A third, religious extremisms of all kinds, everywhere. Christian extremism, Judaic extremism, Buddhist extremism, Islamic, Hindu, all you have begin everywhere here. And either separately or even in combination. And when they combine, nationalism becomes the most powerful combination, aspect of the combination here. And so you begin to have anti-nationalism, anti-immigrant xenophobia, racism, and so on. So these, if you like, were the forms of cultural exclusivism that emerged here. And they emerged in all parts of the world. I've said here, stabilization, authoritarian. What does this mean? Neoliberal globalization is a right-wing shift in economics, characterized by financialization, much greater inequality than ever before, continuity of mass poverty, messing up and decline of the welfare state. Sri Lanka had a much stronger welfare state than India, but even from the 70s onwards, late 70s onwards, etc., your welfare state has also declined and suffered in so many ways. Okay. This right-wing shift globally, it took place globally. However, the world is divided into multiple nation states. And this right-wing economic shift can only stabilize itself if there is a right-wing political and ideological shift in particular countries. Unlike many people who thought that neoliberal globalization will mean that the nation state will decline. And we can come to this, the question, and answer question here. In fact, the number of nation states has increased. And in my view, in fact, it's not taken place, this so-called decline. You have had shifts in function, certainly. But the nation state is crucial for stabilizing the neoliberal order. So it is not a surprise that when you have a right-wing shift economically, you must have a right-wing shift politically and ideologically, and this takes place within the nation state. So please notice something that is very interesting. Whether you talk about Le Pen in France, whether you talk about Jobbik in Hungary, whether you talk about Bolsonaro in Brazil, whether you talk about Modi, whatever, Duterte, whatever, what do you find? Everywhere, the form taken by these right-wing or far-right authoritarian populisms is always an authoritarian nationalism. We have to understand this important aspect about the power of nationalism. Anyway, let me go to the next slide. Now, much more focused on specifically on India. How do we understand the rise of the Sangh Parivar and the BJP? And this really begins to take place from the mid-80s onwards, up to about the middle of the 1970s. The RSS was there, the Jan Sangh, which was the party before that, was there, but they were not gaining ground. They were there, especially the RSS and the VHP, but they were not gaining ground. What helped them? Involvement in the JP movement, which gave them credibility. And then remember, in 1975, Mrs. Gandhi imposed emergency. And in order to give herself a kind of left cover for this emergency, she did not only arrest Maoists and others who were opposed to her, but she arrested RSS cadres on a large scale. So when emergency was over, you had a greater credibility of the RSS. They joined the Janata Party, what was called the Jan Sangh. But the Jan Sangh had to pull out when the Janata Party leadership said you must break your link with the RSS. They refused to do so. They came out. Mrs. Gandhi comes to power back in 1980, right? In 1984, you have a big support for Congress because Mrs. Gandhi is assassinated. And you have the BJP, which has changed its name now, only getting 2 seats. But by 1989, the next elections, it's jumped up to 85 seats. How come? Most importantly, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. This was the most prolonged movement, mass mobilization movement since the independence movement itself. It helped to push its idea of Hindutva forward. This is when you really have a backthrow. And what actually happens also is that other parties concede to it in various ways. You did not have any of the other parties, including the Congress party in Bahar, stopping it and finishing it off for a long time. No, they even made concessions in various ways. That's why we talk about the Congress party actually playing soft Hindutva. But not just that. Anyway, we'll come to that later. What is different about the Sangh Parivar as compared to other far-right forces everywhere? I mentioned the other countries in which you have it. Let me give you 4 reasons why it is so different from the others, whether it's Duterte or any other party. Number 1, longevity. It has existed for over 90 years. What? Correct? The RSS, founded in 1925. 24. Is carrying on. Second, it has the most massive implantation in civil society in India. I don't know how much Buddhist extremist forces in Sri Lanka have an implantation in civil society. But in India, no other force matches it. For a short time, the left could match it in certain parts, Kerala, West Bengal, there. But everywhere, it is the deepest. Let me give you some figures. The RSS, the Sangh Parivar, has got 4 pan-Indian organizations. The BJP, the RSS, the VHP, the Bajrang Dal. It's category of lumpens, stormtroopers, if you like. paramilitary stormtroopers, and so on. 4. It has 36 affiliates. It has 60,000 branches which meet daily or weekly, or even sometimes for your professionals, they'll have special ones for once a month, and so on. Its numbers are in the millions, or just the RSS, maybe 2 to 5 million. They don't keep records, or we can't have access to the records. We don't know, right? It has 800 NGOs connected to it, operating in different fields: education, disaster management, welfare, recreational facilities, training schools of various kinds. All of these things, 800 plus it has over there. It has the largest private network of schools in the whole country. So you have a massive implantation, which other far-right forces, by comparison, do not have. I don't know enough about Sri Lanka. I don't know to what extent the forces here have that great implantation here, but that's there. Third thing which makes it different, unlike any other party, whether bourgeois party or centrist parties or left parties, it has never suffered a major split. The Congress has suffered major splits. The other parties have suffered. The left has suffered major splits, but this has never suffered any major split. This is connected to its ideological coherence. It has a very simple fundamental ideology to which if we cling on to, it's enough in many ways for most people there. We must make India strong. And we must make India strong by providing Hindu unity, because this is a Hindu majority country here. Look at the difference between left forces. The left program is much wider and deeper. Even if you're a group of 10 people and you form a left group, you will have a domestic program, national program, you will have a global program. And you will have, and because your Marxist ideology is to help you to try to understand many things and to push out many ideas, you will have, in a group of 10, you will have 5 splits, because there'll be differences on this, that, etc. The ideology or the framework of the program is much deeper and wider in many ways. But that's not the case here. And the fourth difference between India and other countries is that the opposition in India to the Sangh, BJP Sangh, is much weaker. That's not the case in Brazil. It's not the case in the Philippines, where the other bourgeois parties, right-wing but not far-right, whatever, here, can come together, oppose it. It's not the case in France or elsewhere, but here you have that. So how does Hindutva emerge? One way I'm looking at how it has emerged would be to say that from the late 70s, 80s onwards, you've had the Indian polity which has been shaped, if you like, by the interconnection, intersection, and interweaving of 6 processes. What are those 6 processes? One, obviously, the ongoing forward march of Hindutva. This forward march has had some stops, no reverses, some stops, some hesitation, and then moves. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower. Second, the ongoing forward march of the backwards castes. This also, the OBCs, which we call in India, the middle caste, the intermediate caste, that began to assert themselves, especially after the Mandal agitation, Mandal reforms, which gave them reservations in government jobs and in education. How far this is going, we can talk, but that is there. Third, Dalit assertion. What some people have called the second democratic revolution, which is an exaggeration, but Dalit assertion. Fourth, Muslim ferment. Muslims have come to recognize themselves as a Muslim under pressure. What happened in the late 60s and 70s is that the religious influence among Muslims in India was declining, because you begin to have a Muslim middle class which was much more concerned about secular issues, education, employment, welfare, all of these things. But what has happened in India, because of a whole history of communal rights, is that this has forced Muslims, right, to recognize themselves as a besieged community. Because in your communal rights, which polarize like nothing else, the biggest sufferers have obviously been Muslims. Up to the up to the late 1980s, there used to be government statistics. So Paul Brass has pointed this out, in which Muslims are 14% of the population, but 75% of the casualties. Now, the Indian government does not give you by religion the casualties that take place over here. But obviously, Muslims have suffered more. So once upon a time, if you like, the Muslim in Kerala or in Tamil Nadu and the Hindu in Tamil Nadu would have many more similarities among each other than the Muslim would have in Tamil Nadu with the Muslim in North India. Similarly, you had the same with the Hindu. That has greatly weakened, and the sense of Muslims becoming a besieged community has become much stronger, and there is much Muslim ferment. Also, you've had the regionalization of the Indian polity. Regional politics and regional political parties became more important, and this was, of course, the whole basis of the coalitions that were formed for a long time during the beginning of the 80s onwards, as it were, late 70s, beginning of the 80s onwards. Will this continue in the future? We'll have to think about that. We can maybe discuss that here. And sixth, the rise of a reactionary middle class. You have, in absolute numbers, a very substantial section of what we call the middle class. And this has been reactionary. It has been the big support base of the BJP, in the sense that earlier, the BJP had its support among Badiyas and the trading community here. But it has expanded more downwards to take in the middle class, even some sections of the Dalits, and it has moved upwards to take also the middle class, the upper middle class, and also capital. So in fact, you have had this reactionary middle class. I wonder if in Sri Lanka, what is the most important support base for Buddhist revanchism? Is it also the middle class, even as it has spread downwards or upwards? Or is it always it? I don't know about the case of the middle class there, but in India, obviously, this has been a very important factor in propelling the BJP onwards. So what now is the domestic agenda of the BJP? Please note that you had, if you like, the rise of the BJP. Let me come back to that here. The rise of the BJP, I said, was from the mid-80s onwards. Mid-80s onwards. But how does the BJP come to power? First note, you have the Janata Party coming to power in 1977 at the end of emergency. This is a bourgeois centrist party, right? This is there. Then you have the VP Singh government in 1989. Chandrasekhar VP Singh government, another bourgeois centrist party. Then you have in 1991 the Congress party coming to power, but for the first time with a minority, and then it engineers defections to stay in power. And in 1996, the BJP is the single largest party, but can only stay in power for 13 days because the other parties say, no, not secular, we will not align with it. 2 years later, it comes to power in 1998, and it is no longer untouchable. Other regional political parties align with it. In 2002, you have a massacre, a pogrom in Gujarat. And although it was a coalition party, none of the parties in the coalition broke away saying how terrible this is. What is happening? You are having the acceptability by other regional parties of Hindutva, even to the extent when it carries out programs. And of course, the Congress party from the 80s also shifted to play soft Hindutva and so on, etc. here. So you actually had the BJP coming to power in 1998 after there were 3 failed centrisms, because 1977 Janata Party, VP Singh's National Front, and the party in 1996, which came to party, I'm sorry, I can't find here, they don't last a full term. The BJP comes after the decline, not just of the Congress, but of all these centrist forces here. Okay. Domestic agenda. Now the BJP comes to power under Modi with a slim majority in 2014. a greater majority in 2019. Since 2014 and continuing now, what is its basic domestic agenda? It, if you like, has attained a certain hegemony, and it is expanding its hegemony. When we talk about hegemony, let us understand what hegemony is. Huh? Hegemony requires four things. One, it requires that you be the party which is the principal arbiter between different sections of capital. The BJP is now the most important arbiter among the different sections of the ruling class, the capital. Number one, you must have support from your broad middle class and professionals to a considerable extent, which it does. Third, through sticks and carrots, you have to control the lower masses. Sticks and carrots, okay, which it does in various ways also. Fourth, there will always be tensions between the working classes and the ruling classes. There will always be tensions between those below and above. If you are going to have hegemony, you have to mask that. You have to cover that up, and you have to provide some kind of unifying framework or ideology to bring it along. And that, of course, gets connected to the question of nationalism, which is what I was mentioning before. And therefore, you have, as Gramsci said, if you want to establish hegemony, you have to establish a national popular will. And that, in a sense, is what Hindu nationalism has done. And it has shifted the center of gravity of Indian politics to the right. And you have Congress and so many other parties conceding to it in various ways. That is taking place here. What are its four goals? In order to not just expand, but stabilize and keep its hegemony going for a long time. Four things I've said. It wants to eliminate and subordinate electoral competitors. The only national party, which is now really more of a regional party, is the Congress. It would like to finish off the Congress if possible, and even control the other regional parties and spread itself into other states. And with an up and down motion, it is doing that. Second, not to eliminate all democratic institutions. It doesn't want to eliminate all democratic rights for Hindus or whatever. It wants to hollow it out, and also hollow out federalism. Hollow it out, make it less. And for this, its most important role, which has succeeded to a large extent, is to maintain greater control and influence over the judiciary and over the repressive apparatus, the police. Again, I think that there is at least more contestation, I may be wrong, in Sri Lanka with any force that wants to expand itself here. But in India, it has moved here, hollowing out democratic institutions and federalism. Third, inferiorize, terrorize, and ghettoize, particularly Muslims, but not just Muslims, of course, the biggest brunt. When it comes to Christians, they're only 2.5%. But Christian institutions are very significant, and therefore it must attack Christian institutions and weaken them. The new policies on NGOs, for example, and foreign funding. And also, it must oppose Christian conversion, especially in central India. Northeast India, not such a problem. Very small states, they depend upon the center here. But in central India, tribal areas against conversions here. About liberals, it doesn't like liberals. It wants to minimize dissent as much as possible. Okay, liberals, we have to fix you. Leftists, of course we have to fix you. We have to harass you, and if possible, punish you. And if we can get away with even hammering you and finishing you off, we will want to do that. So here, so Muslim sector, that's your third. What is your fourth area? Ideological homogenization. And here, the question of the media, the question of education, obviously what they're doing in the educational field here, and what they're doing incidentally in Bollywood. Perhaps you don't know that for the first time under the Modi regime, Bollywood, the Hindi film industry, has actually become, formally speaking, an industry, which means that the central government can intervene to a much greater extent. And of course, it is intervening in various ways here, censorship, funds, and so on, etc. That's here. As I said, the central message of the BJP Sangh is making India strong. How do you make India strong? We must unite Hindus. So then the question becomes, how do you unite Hindus? Only two ways. Not three ways, not four ways, not five ways, only two ways. Either you find, or both you use, you have to find some principle of unity within Hinduism. The only possible candidate for them is a loose and accommodating Brahmanism. Brahmanism, but we'll accommodate you to whatever they are, but loose. But you can only go so far because of the caste system. The second principle of unification is to unify all Hindus against an outsider, Muslims. Okay. So that too are there, and they use both, of course. But how do you create anger against Muslims? And they're only 14% of the population. Nobody in their right mind can say that Muslims dominate India. How do you do this? Huh? One, you play the politics of historical revenge. There in the past, Mughals ruled us, Turks ruled us, etc. And then you use the word Muslim to cover up all of those differences and say the politics of historical revenge. Second, you create grievances today. And I used to be part of the anti-racist struggle in England for 13 years. And white racists, in order to create grievance against black people, which was only 2-3% at that time, we were all considered black, would talk about grievances in terms of the British state giving benefits to asylums and immigrants that they shouldn't do. You create grievances. So what is the BJP Sangh Parivar doing in India? Creating grievances. There is no uniform personal code. We have a Hindu reform bill, but they are having a personal law. As if Muslims, as if Sangh is very much concerned about the suffering of Muslim women and children. But it's an excuse. The state is treating you differently. This thing. So these differences, why are you giving them benefits? You are appeasing them in different ways, like that. Why should the Muslim majority state of Kashmir, the only one, have such autonomy, even though that autonomy has been eroded? You play grievances. You generate fear. How do you generate fear? Islamophobia. Muslims are terrorists. You have liberals in India saying, all terrorists are not, all Muslims are not terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. So you have this thing. Love jihad. Very interesting. If you have a Muslim male marrying a Hindu woman, that's love jihad. But if you have a Hindu male marrying a Muslim woman, that's coming into our fold. The contempt for women is obvious, and yet you have many women, very senior, in the BJP Sangh Parivar that talk about love jihad. Other way of creating fear. Their fertility is so much greater than I have. They have 4 wives and they'll have 25 children and their population is growing, creating fear. That's it. All right. But remember what I said about nationalism. Nationalism has been crucial. And how do we understand nationalism? 2 ways of understanding nationalism. The cultural, political. Either you say nationalism belongs to the past. It is an inheritance from the past. All nationalisms tend to invent a past, but it's an invention. It's a construction. You can have an ethnic nationalism, you can have a civic nationalism. There are problems even with civic nationalism, but the point here is that if you see nationalism as an inheritance from the past, then there will always be disputes about what is the proper inheritance and who are the proper inheritors. Hinduism is the proper inheritance, and you non-Hindus are not the proper inheritors. Sri Lanka, Buddhism is the fundamental inheritance, and you who are not Buddhists, you had better watch out. That is one way, inheritance. Or you understand nationalism as something that does not belong to the past, but belongs to the present and future. That is to say, it will be what we make of it. What we make of it. And this becomes something very important. You have to keep on fighting to make our nationalism much more humane and progressive. There is an advantage that immigrant societies have because they are based on immigration. Australia, on the United States. There are many things terrible about the United States, but because it's an immigrant society, there is more space for a fight to try to say that this belongs to us present over here. I have said a sleeping beauty concept. Can I ask if all of you are familiar with the story of Sleeping Beauty? Are you familiar with the story of Sleeping Beauty or not?
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
You are familiar, right? What do they say? They have a sleeping beauty concept. What is it? They say the sleeping beauty of India, which has been sleeping for so long, submerged, is the essential Hinduness of India. It has to be awakened. And just like Prince Charming awakened the sleeping beauty by giving it a kiss, today India's Prince Charming, which are the forces of Hindutva, must give the kiss of politics to this sleeping beauty of Hinduism and wake it. And just like Sleeping Beauty was put to sleep by the terrible witch, who put Hinduism to sleep in India? Was it Turks? Was it Persians? Was it Afghans? Was it Mughals? No, it was Muslims. Because when you say Muslims, you can cover all of them. And you can make ordinary Muslims who migrated here, there, whatever, also part of this thing here. Incidentally, the biggest concentration of Muslims was always outside the Mughal Empire, in Kerala, where they came through trade, and else, and also in Kashmir. But anyway, here. So you have, if you like, sleeping beauty concept, which is there. We have to fight this on the terrain of nationalism. We have to fight our nationalism to make it much more humane and democratic. But you will notice that I've also said but. So even as we fight for democratic nationalisms, we have to recognize that there are issues which can only be resolved today at the international level. And as Marxists, as leftists, as Marxists, we above all have to maintain the banner of internationalism on questions of poverty, on questions of the ecology, on the question of nuclear weapons and dangers. We have to fight at the international level. But our route to fighting it also has to go through nationalism. We have to fight for a more progressive nationalism in order to go beyond nationalism and to move ahead. And now let me come to the last slide. The last slide is, I am saying that Sangh Parivar has got a certain expanding hegemony influence, which means that the struggle against this is long-term. It's not simply a question of some other coalition of non-BJP parties coming to power and that will be okay here. You've had a real shift here. And you have to have a long-term struggle against it. And I say that what are the ways? And in order to have a long-term struggle, you have to have a long-term actor, which is the most important actor in fighting to transform society. Now here you will say, there are 5 possible candidates for which is the most important actor around which you have to build. One lot says, we have no choice. The BJP, Sangh is a far-right force with fascistic characteristics. We have to look to the other bourgeois parties. We have to look to them because they're not the same. Yes, they're not the same. They are right-wing, ugly right-wing, but they're not as they are. But do we look to them? Are they going to fight against it? But they themselves have paved the way for it. But they themselves have also moved towards soft Hindutva. My answer is no. Yes, you can have tactical alliances, recognizing the difference. And what do we mean by tactical alliances? They happen at 3 levels. 1, an alliance at the level of a single demand. So a particular demand in which you get all forces come here. Second, a set of demands. For example, the BMS, which is the trade union wing of the Sangh Parivar, is also unhappy about the labor codes. You can have tactical alliances. If you like the classic view, march separately, strike together. Third, one has to think about it, possibly even at the electoral level, in order to keep the BJP out. But these are tactical alliances. Do not mistake your relationships of these kind as strategic alliances or them as strategic actors. So the first lot is out. What about progressive movements of all kinds? And India is full of progressive movements of all kinds. Displacement movement, against displacement, against tribal oppression, against all kinds of progressive movements that we've had here, against mining and so on. But these movements can come together, and this is something that you have a lot of people like Manuel Castells and others talking about. Forget building a party or anything like parties. We have to build a network, or if you like, a network of networks of these various movements. I won't go into this, but this is not really the answer. The only serious attempt to build a kind of network which could then intervene at the electoral level and generally has been what is called the National Alliance of People's Movement, Medha Patkar, in India. It has not succeeded. It's been there now for the last 30 years. It's not succeeded. And there are real problems with this idea that you can just link together these different silos and movements here. So that's your second, not on. Third, the anti-caste movement. Caste and mobilizing the caste, lower caste against can really defeat Hindutva. Not succeeded. Why not? The anti-caste movement in India has fought for material benefits, reservations. Good. We support it. It has fought for greater dignity and respect. Good. We support it. It has also fought to have its own levers of power, which means that it makes cross-caste alliances above with other castes, including upper castes and Brahmins and other upper sections of the backward caste, and also with others. And the anti-caste movement has been based upon certain subcastes of the Dalits or the untouchables, and not on others. And this has not succeeded. All the anti-caste movements swear by Ambedkar. We understand that. We respect Ambedkar. But Ambedkar eventually gave up on trying to finish off the caste system. He finally decided to get out of the caste system by escaping. That is, by converting into Buddhism. But please notice that these neo-Buddhists, over the last 70 years, the proportion of neo-Buddhists has remained roughly the same. That is to say, all the Dalit parties and all the lower caste parties which talk about Ambedkar have not even followed his path of wholesale this thing to Buddhism in order to be able to fight it here. Your fourth possible strategic actor, the existing left parties. Now here you have parties like the CPM, CPI, which are basically social democratic parties. Just like social democratic parties in Europe have shifted to the right, they've also shifted to the right, but on foreign policy, they are to the left of your social democratic parties of Europe or Japan. They're more critical of the United States imperialism and so on. But they have shifted. They were once upon a time strong cadre base, but that cadre itself has greatly weakened. It does not come to terms with Stalinism. How are you going to do that? All of these problems are there. What about the Maoists? I will only simply say that the Maoists is a strategic dead end. The idea that you can imitate Mao's liberation, countryside surrounding the city and all that, and even their base, not on. The fifth strategic actor, which is the one that we have to build, is building a new left. And this new left will come from various sources. It can come from trade unions throwing up groups or parties. It can come from splits and fusions within the existing left. It can come through various ways, new groups coming together, whatever. But you have to build a newer kind of left. And I talk about three concentric circles. What I mean by three concentric circles, if you like, are something like this. Your hub is your new left. The boundaries are porous. They're not fixed. You have here building a newer left alongside it, along with the left, etc., transforming it, changing it, etc. Your second circle are your progressive movements, your progressive social movements of various kinds. And your third circle are the existing bourgeois parties or whatever, which are not BJP or which know that the rise of the BJP and the Sun can also mean that they will be finished. So you have these three circles, but the key is really building that here. And you will build it in various ways. Now, what is the program by which you have to fight to build that? Number one, what are the weak spots of the Sangh Parivar here? It is against neoliberalism. Its weak spots are jobs, welfareism. Obviously, public education, quality healthcare, public health care, social security, all of these you have to fight here. Second, we have to fight for electoral reforms, but there's a problem. We should be having a proportional representation system, a mixed representation system. In fact, the proportion that is voted for the BJP is always much less than never. In fact, no party has come to power with 50% in general elections at the center. Not even the Congress. No party has come there. Yeah, and if you have proportional representation, you have smaller parties. It's much more democratic, and so on. Today, your other regional parties, because apart from the BJP, the other parties that are regional parties, they should be able to see some sense that if you have proportional representation, this would be a check on the BJP. But they won't go for it. You know why? Because at the state level, they don't want proportional representation, so they can come to power with only a section, either on their own or with coalitions of various kinds, etc. And yet we should be at least propagating the idea of electoral, proportional representation, electoral reforms. Other electoral reforms, money. It is said of the United States that the United States is the best democracy that money can buy. I would say that India is one of the worst democracies that money can buy. I don't know about Sri Lanka and how much money you have to have in order to be able to get your way, etc. But this question of electoral reform would take in so many questions. The Election Commission, which is the other institution, the BJP has squeezed it, has influenced it in various ways, just like it has done the judiciary. Fourth, eradicating caste. We have to put the question of caste here, and here the question is class. We have to connect caste to class. The near majority of Dalits, untouchables, are landless laborers or informal sector. But the majority of landless laborers and of informal sectors are not Dalits. You have to have an alliance here, and you have to talk in terms of transformation, either in terms of even land reforms as well as all kinds of cooperatives, other things that you have to do here. You can't simply just go on about caste, and then try to, because what has actually happened is that caste, far from disappearing or weakening, has become politically stronger than before. We have to fight for deeper democratization, because even among majority Hindus, there is a sense that democracy is important and that we have to have it, because otherwise, So there are various levels at which you can fight for democracy, deeper democratization. But the key for building the new left has to be, and the key for being able to have a long-term strategy, because what I'm talking about is that you cannot decisively and permanently defeat Hindutva without decisively defeating neoliberal capitalism. And since neoliberal capitalism, in my view, I may be wrong, but I believe it is now the only form of capitalism. You are not going to have a social democratic interregnum of capitalism, which doesn't mean that you mustn't fight for reforms. Of course we must fight for reforms. Of course we must fight for what Trotsky talked about in terms of transitional demands. Obviously we have to fight for that. But I'm saying that they have given, Sangh Parivar has given a transformative agenda, a transformative India. We will shape India. We have to give our own transformative agenda. And that really means fighting against capitalism, fighting against communalism here. How do we do that? The similarity between the far right in India and the moderate left and the far left, the radical left, is there's a similarity. What is that similarity? The far right is a cadre force. The Sangh Parivar is a cadre force, right? If you are going to be strong in an electoral democracy, and if you belong to the moderate left or the radical left, it is what you do outside parliament that is most important for you to succeed within the electoral arena. It's what you do outside. In order to be able to effectively work outside, you have to have cadres who are ideologically committed and ideologically disciplined and are able to be part of various movements of various kinds over there. And that helps you. The difference between the right and the far right cadre force and the left cadre force is that once the far right cadre force gets electoral success, the ruling classes are happy to sustain it. But the left will always fight that when it has electoral success, the ruling classes and others will fight against it. But nevertheless, we have to build cadres. And how do we build cadres? We build it in two ways. One, through ideological education, what you are seeking to do through these Marxist schools and others. But even more important than ideological education is the question of activism, of activists in different areas connected to that. This is a long-term agenda. Let's not fool ourselves. And since I'm saying that in order to defeat decisively, not just weaken it, but decisively, that it comes up again, to weaken it decisively, we have to have a transformative agenda. We have to have a transformative struggle, a long-term struggle in which socialism will come on the agenda, because this capitalism cannot resolve fundamental problems that we are faced with today. If you look at the ecological crisis, for example, that is going to take place here, it's going to create fortresses of the rich and the powerful in order to protect themselves, because you will have a flooding of many of the coastal areas in India. And then you'll have others trying to protect themselves over here. I don't know what the situation is in Sri Lanka Islands there, but ecological damage and rising sea levels and other issues are going to create huge problems of various kinds over here. And there will be the right and the powerful and the wealthy will try to keep fortresses, and they will want more repression here. So in other words, we have a long-term agenda. Let's get on with the task of building cadres through ideological education and activism. And I think I should stop there. Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks, Professor Vanaik, for excellent presentation. And now time for the discussion. Can ask questions or comments. Yeah, we have about 1 hour left for that.
Yeah.
Who's going to start? Kalpa, you have?
Yeah, I just have a comment. Thank you very much, Professor Vanaik, for the excellent and very informative presentation. I learned a lot of things, and I have some questions as well, but I just wanted to say that the way you started the presentation in comparing the God's time and the transformation of God's time into the modernity, and the changes took place, and it's so interesting that that the way that in the intertwinement between the God's time and the modern time of capitalism, the transformation of God's time into capitalist time. And it's a very interesting thing, because I was reading Daniel Ben Sides' Marx for Our Time.
Yes.
And he talks about, he particularly talks about how the class struggle can give a different meaning to the time. That's something really interesting that I found in the presentation. I'll come to my questions later on, but someone can comment on your presentation.
Can you just hold on? Let me just get a pen so I can write down some of these questions and then answer. Just hold on a second, please.
Right. You can ask questions in singular.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, he's ready. So.
Yeah, may I ask Vanaik?
And yeah, Kumar.
Thanks. Achin, thank you so much for talking your talk, and which is always a delight to listen to. My question is really to ask you to please go back to where you began your talk today, to unpack a little what you spoke to us about on secularism and the state or rather state and society. Um, and I recall that even more than 20 years ago, in your Furies of Indian Communalism, that particular chapter was one that I had difficulty. Alas, I'm 20 years old, so I ask particular context, Achin. I wonder if you could elaborate on some of the political points you were making by reference to left practice, to left political practice. And the context uh, in, for me in Sri Lanka is this, that in the 1940s and 1950s, you had organized religion, both in the form of the Catholic Church as well as the Buddhist Sangha, as being ideological opponents of the left. And the areas in which the left was electorally active, there was enormous mobilization by religious leaders, both Buddhist and Catholic, against left candidates and so on. So the path to power for the left in Sri Lanka involved an accommodation with organized religion. One, to say that that the left does not have any principled objection to people professing faith, and that in fact that the left were not themselves atheists, non-believers, godless, and so on. And so that involved an adaptation to religious practice and religious life, which has continued to the present day. So that means delegations to religious leaders, presenting left political programs and proposals, almost as if to get the blessings of these religious leaders, and more significantly, there has been absolutely no push from, of course, now an extremely weak left, for the displacement of religion from the state, right? So what was introduced into the Constitution of Sri Lanka in 1972, preeminent place for Buddhism. Actually, no left force has, parliamentary or extra parliamentary, has placed on its program the reversal of this. But and I want to, and I promise to close here. But I also want to ask you to really expand on what you said about society and religiosity, and how we also engage or combat that, because also the weakness of the left and the fact that it did not place this on its political agenda means that basically left thinking today in Sri Lanka is an adaptation of a liberal understanding of the role of religion, the rightful place of religion, and this separation between state and society, so that as long as somehow it's not part of the state, it's okay if it continues to inhabit and entrench itself in society. So I wonder, with this little background, if you could please go back to those opening slides and talk us through why it was so important for you to lay that groundwork in terms of different understandings of secularity, modernism, and so on. And also, perhaps please, again, in reference to left political practice, what you think have been some of the dead ends that have been taken. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Could I take this question, because it's a very important question, and I would like to speak at a little bit length of this here. It's a question. It's really related to the question of secularization. Remember, I said secularization means decline, compartmentalization, and rationalization. And secularization is supposed to relate to society, and the secular state, of course, is what does you mean by the secular state? I've given you my minimalist definition of what constitutes a secular state. But you have variants of secular state in different parts of the world. right? And those variants come about because different states, secular states even, have different approaches to the question of to what extent should they intervene in religious matters when it comes to public policy and law. Uh, uh, Work by some, and one way of looking at it is that you have, in the case of, say, France, one-sided exclusion. Religion has to be kept completely out of the state. There's no question of this of religion interfering with the state. The state can intervene in religion. So, for example, it does things today like banning minarets, banning hijab, let alone niqab, not giving land for mosques, and so on. Now, these are not necessarily good things that they're doing, because they attack the freedom to dress, which will be influenced by religion and so on. But that's one understanding of secular. You have another understanding of secular in the United States, where there's mutual exclusion. Religion can do whatever you like in society, but not here in the state. But there is religious influence on the state on specific matters. But it's not as dangerous as in India or in Sri Lanka, in which the religious influence and control is increasing on the state. And the state, if you like, is prepared to align itself with a particular religion. It's a real problem in South Asia. Okay. So what do you do about this question of secular state and secularization? And this has to be handled very carefully, because there is a certain relationship between the secular state and secularization. It is not always the case that the more you secularize in terms of eliminating the influence of religion in public political life outside of the state, that you will have a stable secular state. Let me give you two examples. Kemal Atatürk's Turkey forced secularization in society. What did this do? It was a dictatorship. It actually pushed local popular support for the mullahs. Forced secularization in society actually increased the loyalty of ordinary people because of dictatorship, lack of democracy behind the mullahs supported them. What did you have in Poland under communist rule? You had most ordinary people being Catholics. You had a forced secularization in society, which did not undermine the influence of Catholicism. And after communism over, it came up. The same thing has happened in Turkey, in which it has resurfaced. Therefore, the question of how you handle the question of secularization of society, to which I give most importance, is very important. You have made some very, very important points about religiosity and so on, but I'll come to that. Please note that in the very beginning, I said secularization is not about eliminating religion, but about establishing new terms of coexistence in society between the religious and the secular, right? It's about making religion optional, making it to a larger extent private, but not completely private, because in politics you will have groups and all which want to intervene, and you are entitled to. And how you privatize it becomes very, very important. For example, in the United States of America, you have a kind of privatization of religion which is connected to the marketplace. It's a kind of marketization of religion. The market is for the individual. The central principle of the market is methodological individualism, the individual. So in the United States, you as an individual, you choose. But this marketization, consumerization, has actually made shifts within religion a form of therapy, and it has not undermined the influence of religious groups in society here. The question here is very, very important. I'll just come here. Atheism? No. As Lenin once said about the members of the Bolshevik party, whether you are an atheist or not is not important. We are not bothered about whether there is a heaven above. We want to make a heaven on earth, and that's what's important. You have in Christianity, much less so in Islam, not at all in Hinduism, not in Buddhism, But you've had liberation theology, in which liberation theologians, inspired by their understanding of Christianity, coming close and connecting with Marxism in Latin America and elsewhere to fight against this here. Why? Because for them, it was not so much the beliefs that was important, but the believers and wanted to do that over here. So liberation theology. I could go on about why, but I won't here. So what do we mean? Let's understand the power of religion. Why do ordinary people believe in religion? And they believe it for the following reasons. Health. Oh God, give me good health. Wealth. The person is trading with the idol. Please make sure that I have wealth. Power. Oh, please help me to fix my teacher who's giving me bad marks, or fix my neighbor who is troubling me. I want power. Please fix whatever. Fourth, solace. How do you cope with the death of a loved one? Your child. This thing here. Do you think Marxism will give you that solace? But religion provides solace for that. 5, a sense of community. This is me, because we all ask ourselves the question, who am I? Where do I belong? But if this is weaker, but the national community is the strongest, but community. A guideline for morality. My religion says this is bad, this is not bad, etc. A lot of weaknesses, but it provides that. 7, a sense of immortality. When I die, my soul will live on. I mean something. I'm not there. These are very powerful aspects, and only one thing gives you all this. Nevertheless, religion is weaker than nationalism. I can come to that if you ask me a question about that. But are we out to do that? No. We're talking about the terms of coexistence between it, and this is something that we have to handle very carefully. And how? For example, the question you raise is very important. Well, we're not atheists. Yes, we're secularization. But what about this damn public religiosity that is all over the place? Is this a good thing? Should we just keep quiet about it? Or should we not do something about it? Yes, we have to do something about it. The question is how we do it, and very importantly here. For example, why is it that we have to do something about it? Religion provides a prism, your religious identity. In modern times, you have many more identities. You have multiple identities of various kinds. You have much more self-reflexive identities. You'll have a Muslim who's a proud Muslim but drinks. And says, I'm a Muslim. In other words, you have a certain revisability of that. Third, you have greater combinations. The religious identity with the national identity with this, that. And what is modern life about? Modern life about is shifting your particular identity at particular issues. Class identity is absolutely crucial for fighting for socialism. Your family identity becomes important with your family. You may have the identity of having gone to a convent school. You may have all. And much of modern life is really shifting and not having one prism, or which is the dominant prism from which you look at everything. Now, public religiosity tends to reinforce the importance of the religious identity to look at everything, or to look at many more things which it should not be looking at. How do you weaken this religious identity, this prism? This is where you have to recognize that religious organizations, fundamentalists, religious nationalist, communalist forces get their religious loyalty, not just about what they say about their religion, but also because of all kinds of secular needs, and they get loyalty because they're able to dress. If we are able to establish a welfare state in which, irrespective of religion, you are able to connect it, you weaken the importance of religious identity here. So that is one area on the secular terrain. What about on the religious terrain itself? Do we not fight against some of these ideas of religion that they put forward and so on? Yes, we have to, but do it carefully. You have to do it. Why? Because what has happened is in India, look, you know, rationalist organizations, you heard of Gauri Lankesh, you've heard of Dabolkar, you've heard of Pansare, you've heard of them. They had rationalist organizations and they were killed by the RSS, BJP, VHP, Sangh Parivar. Why were they killed? Because they were attacking supernaturalism. What supernaturalism does, of course, that's the whole question of the scientific temper. Supernaturalism, of course, gives you a false understanding. Remember the third thing I said about secularization? It's rationalization. You have to fight for greater rationality. Rationality to understand the world and all. And you do fight it in various ways. You have to have rationalist movements. You have to oppose all this nonsense about mystical gods who have gun power and all the rest of it, etc. In fact, one of the things which is interesting with regard to Christianity, for example, as compared to elsewhere, is that there has been a certain separation of science from religion, whereby believing Christians are accept natural science explanations for the natural world and just comfort themselves with saying, well, God made the laws of nature. And the laws of nature are indeterminate. They can go this way. So we have no difficulty accepting evolution. Because God made that. But there is a God. And if you look at the Indian parliament, and if you look at your parliament, then you sometimes have to believe that Darwin was right and that we are cousins to bloody chimpanzees. Because look at all the monkeys that are there in parliament. But my point is that this separation has meant that you could have this is much less in the case of Hinduism, where the magic and mystery is all connected, and you have a bloody Prime Minister of India saying that India had plastic surgery in the past, because you had plastic surgery in terms of a transplantation of an elephant head onto a man. He doesn't even know the difference between transplantation and plastic surgery, but you believe it. And you have all kinds of scientists who believe in all this here, right? So we don't have that, what I would call scientific revolution, the spreading of a much more scientific temper. And it's a mistake for leftists to dismiss this scientific temper, but one has to be careful, of course, in how you fight it. And this scientific temper is important because it weakens the claim of religion to a whole host of other factors. And why is it important to cut down on religiosity? Some work has been done empirically by a person called Nicholas Keddy. And he has pointed out that where you have high public religiosity, you have a stronger correlation with more religious fundamentalisms and extremisms. So there is a kind of loose connection. I said correlation because I'm not clear about what the relationship is. In the Hindu-Indian case, when you have a lot of public religiosity, what happens? If you don't attack supernaturalism and how you are giving much greater power to sadhs, to priests, to all of these people, to mullahs and others, to deal with their understanding of ordinary people about life. So you do have to have that here. But how we do it is very, very important. And it has to be connected, if you like, to the struggle for secular needs and loyalties. Because even for the left, remember that we will get mass support, not simply because everybody has understood the depth or the theory of Marxism or this, that, etc., but for loyalties which are built on the fact that you have helped them in their lives, as it were, etc. So what we are basically saying is religion in its place. And we have to fight to make that place modest. But how we fight, how can we fight here? That is one. Second, even as we fight on the terrain, I say much more important is the question of what we do outside the terrain, even as we fight for scientific temper, all of these things. So yes, this public religiosity is growing. It is a danger. It cannot be like it was in the past, where, of course, religion was more importance. But this is also connected to my 4 points about declining democracy, neoliberal exploitation, this whole question of ideological disarray here. After the 90s, what you had in the globally was the spread of procedural democracy. So dictatorships in Africa and elsewhere became weak, very limited democracies, proceduralism here. But substantively everywhere, the content of democracy declined. Because when you talk about democracy, you should also be talking about industrial democracy, health democracy, all of these things here. That has declined, it has weakened. So that element has also gone down here. You have to fight to strengthen the question of democracy. And elsewhere, we have to fight at the levels that I'm talking about, religiosity and so on. But how you fight it is very, very important here. There may even be a space for liberation theology type things, but it's very interesting that liberation theology has come in Christianity and to a limited extent in Islam. The Islamist Marxist groups, for example, who fought against the Shah of Iran. Why is it not in Hinduism and Buddhism? I suspect that is because the concept of the transcendence in Buddhism and Hinduism is different from that in the Semitic religions. Huh? And both have their strengths and limitations. I can again talk about that, but I won't. In the case of Buddhism and Hinduism, the transcendent being is a state of affairs. And you too can eventually reach that. So you too can reach nirvana. Or you too can also reach the question of Atma, the combination of Atma and Brahma. This thing here. It is a kind of march to perfection in which different people are at different level, distances from the, towards that overall goal. In the case of the Semitic religion, the God is there, you can never become like God. Huh? There's a kind of separation there which allows for a certain degree of here. The weaknesses, the propositional concept of Semitic religions, which has led to wars in the name of Christianity and Islam, which you do not have to the same extent in Hinduism and Buddhism. In other words, the relationship between religious and society is one which is always mediated by so many factors. Huh? And Buddhism, of course, cannot be the answer towards that. Let me just also add the question of nationalism. If we can fight on the terrain of nationalism to make it much more humane and democratic, we'll be taking care of this bloody religious nationalism to a great extent. Please notice something. Although religion is so powerful, it is less powerful than nationalism, which is why religious groups which want to be politically powerful try to co-opt nationalism. If they try to go past it, like the ISIS and all, nowhere. The whole of Islam, of the Islamic world is divided with regard to nations, not just Sunni Shia, which was much less earlier, and now has become here, is divided. Buddhism can provide unity between Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand. No, it's not going to be. If somebody says Buddhism is more, nationalism is much more powerful. Hindutva, it talks about a Khand Bharat. But if RSS, Sangh Parivar says to Nepalis, you Nepalis, you are Hindus in your majority. Give up your Nepaliness and join us in making a big Akhand Bharat. Or it tells your Tamil Hindus in Sri Lanka, forget about Tamil Elam. Come and join us in making a larger Hindu entity. You know what the Nepalis will say? Nepalis say, we are Hindus, we are proud of it. But you, Mr. India, big brother, don't tell us that we should give up our Nepaliness. And I suspect that your Tamil, Jaffna Tamils and others who are Hindus are not going to say that we will just give up this thing here. Why? Why is nationalism more powerful than religion? And this has to do with the fact of its political dimension. There was a book written by Benedict Anderson which talked about imagined communities. Religion is an imagined community, but please remember, the nation is an imagined political community. The political dimension of nationalism gives it more power. What is that political dimension? One, what happens with the emergence of the nation state, which is a modern phenomenon, is that the nation state becomes accountable to the people. And you are all citizens equally. You are citizens equally. That is to say, you had a transition from being a subject to becoming a citizen. Even if you have a dictatorship, whether it's Rajapaksa, authoritarianism, Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka, or whether it is Imran Khan or Yahya Khan in Pakistan, they don't say the state belongs to my family. Alas, it belongs to you, the Sri Lankan people. It belongs to you. I'm doing this for your benefit. What I'm saying to you is that there is a new concept of accountability that becomes very, very important. If you like, the people are the legitimizers of rule. They're not the exercisers of rule, but they become the legitimizers. And this is something that's getting powerful. Secondly, you have a certain horizontal equality, citizenship equality. Citizenship equality is that you are all equally citizens. You may not be equals. You are all. So what should I say? Citizen worthiness. Citizen. You are equally as citizens. Citizens who are equally. You are worthy citizens. Equally worthy citizens. Huh? That may be the point here as citizenship. So this question of nationalism becomes important. The way to fight successfully against religion and religiosity is to work at all the levels that I'm suggesting, but relating to a newer concept of nationalism, which is much more humane and this thing, and connecting it also to internationalism. No shortcuts. This is a very good question you've asked. I'm not sure how much I've been able to explain it, but yes, we fight for secularization, but we fight alongside it for so many other things as well.
I think Raghu had a question previously.
Yes.
Raghu? Yes.
Yes. Was your question about time and bedside? No, that was not that. No, sorry.
Yeah, it was just a comment. But Raghu had a question.
Yes. Which was that? Just tell me again.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning from Canada. Nice to see you through the magic of Zoom. I hope you can hear me. My question actually had more to do with the political strategy component of your presentation. And so it's a bit off to the side of the central question of secularism, and so forth. But I was just curious if you could explain a bit when you said that the approach of building a network of movements has failed in India, and you gave the example of Medha Patkar over the last 30 years. As I said, it's a bit off to the side of the central theme of your talk, but if you could just say a few words about that, because as you know, whether here in Canada or in South Asia or anywhere, given the discrediting of the party political model, including of a far left organizational model, many people continue to promote the idea of a network of social movements as the best strategy of resistance to the right-wing neoliberal onslaught, and also for building an alternative political project. And yet most aren't aware of the fact that this isn't some new idea, new strategy that's being put forward. That's something that's actually been in place for 30, 40 years, as you've said. So it'd be interesting to know why you say in the Indian case, it's been a failure over the past 30 years. And if you could explain why it has been a failure. And how that fits into, therefore, this whole idea you have of the concentric model that you also talked about in your presentation. Just lastly, you mentioned there's actually no ban on minarets in France that I'm aware of. That's
not in France. It's in other European countries. It's in other European countries. It took place, for example, there was a ban on minarets.
Switzerland.
Which was there in Switzerland. So I was just talking generally. Did I mention? Right. Did I say France by mistake? No, I just said France about the hijab.
Right.
I meant the minarets as well.
And okay, just to finish on France, it's interesting because there's not as strict a separation of church and state as one thinks. It's more a form of contract. So most people don't know, and it's actually interesting that in France, there's actually central and local government payment of teacher salaries and operating costs in thousands of Catholic schools, hundreds of Jewish schools, and only a handful of Muslim schools, but it does exist. And of course, all of this is framed by an overarching Islamophobia that we're aware of and so forth. But okay, sorry, that was just a side point to something else you said. Okay, thank you. Nice to see all of you again through the magic of Zoom, as they say.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's a good question about the question of the movements, but let me just say about France, you're absolutely right. I did mention that, but I was aware of that. That in fact, one of the criticisms of the French is in fact that they have this kind of special relationship still with Catholic schools and institutions, which is not there really with others at all. Incidentally, you also have within France left groups and all, they're saying that don't go on about hijab and all this stuff, etc. This is ridiculous. Let people have the freedom to dress as they see fit, which will be influenced by various ways, whether you want to wear a bikini or mini skirts, or whether you want to wear this, etc. However, in certain professions, you can't have the niqab, for example, like in teaching or in medicine or something like that. But that's a view that many people, a small group in France say, as well as elsewhere, of course, is much better. For example, Britain is much better. I won't go into that, why that's the case. Okay, with regard to the question of movements and why this has not succeeded, I don't think it can succeed anywhere. And that has to do with the huge problem of how do you build the agency which can carry out an overall transformation of society. In my latest book, which Sumare mentioned, and I'm not just trying to sell the book, I actually have a whole chapter about why I defend the concept of Leninist vanguardism, where the criticism that this is substitutionism, etc., is just ridiculous. I'll get away from that. And yet it's been quite popular and so on. I'm not saying that you have to have a party. We have to be open to the fact that given the heterogeneity of the working class itself, but we need to have maybe a united front of parties, radical parties, whatever, all that, etc. here. But a vanguard formation, that there is a vanguard layer, which is not a fixed. Anyway, if you look at my, if you get a hold of my book, there's a full chapter about this crucial question of why movements are not the real answer here. Let me try just address your question very briefly. The problem with movements is that there are different people in different silos which have fought on specific issues or in specific sectors. For example, the women's sector or the anti-racism sector, or on this particular issue of dams or whatever. Yeah, these are little silos and you have activists there in these silos here. How do you bring them together? You try to bring them together in what you call the most egalitarian form, in which you don't privilege either with regard to that. And you have, if you like, them all coming together here. The problem is organizationally, how do you do this? And at the same time, provide through your organization a basis for the development among these various activists of a larger comprehensive vision with regard to what should be done. Because these movements are specifically specific sector and specific issue movements. And therefore you do not have within them the same kind of thinking about the larger vision which connects you, whether it's to a political party type formation or to a larger left group type formation, and so on, etc. And therefore you have a whole range of that. So for example, in the women's movement, you'll have all kinds of people within the women's movement here. And in fact, what's happened is that liberal feminism has long shot past socialist feminism as a current and so on. So there is a real problem here as compared to what you're trying to do with the building of groups which are like spiders and which have, if you like, their fingers in a whole range of activities, but have an organizational structure in which they all come together and through a process of democratic centralism, because democratic centralism is a political concept. Its organizational features will vary. Democratic centralism simply means the coming together and sharing of the different understandings and experiences of different activists in different areas of activity, which are able to learn from each other and develop that larger vision. And of course, also move in a much more collective and coherent form here. This is the way to. The question of the relationship between the party and movements has been one in which you have many left parties which are not internally democratic, which have had a basically manipulative attitude towards the movements. And it is not surprising that many of these movements have just got fed up with your left parties and others that say, look at the way that they behave. You think you have the understanding. You're not really committed to the movement and such, and so on. But there is no escape from having some kind of a coherent body that can develop this larger vision which must fight against capitalism. If you like, the idea of movements coming together moves in the direction of saying, don't you dare talk about any particular actor being privileged. We are all equal. To me, this is a ridiculous statement. In the struggle against patriarchy, the principal agent will have to be women and others who suffer from that, not men, even though you may have lots of men who are feminists, etc. In the struggle against the caste system, the privileged agency is going to be the lower caste. It doesn't mean there. What we are saying, when we want as Marxists, we are not saying that we are the privileged agency for every struggle for which movements are involved in. But we are, that is to say, the working class, in the broader sense, is the privileged agency for fighting to eradicate capitalism. So let's get away from this idea that in the name of egalitarianism, how they talk. The second point you have to understand is that when we talk about these different forms of oppression, right, the relationship between them and capitalism is one which is asymmetric. Capitalism influences those struggles, those oppression struggles, and those oppressions more than they influence capitalism, which is not to say that they don't influence it. Huh? If you like, you are not going to be able to get rid of these necessary oppressions without getting rid of capitalism is the necessary but not sufficient condition for getting rid of many of these oppressions. But if you stick to the oppressions alone within capitalism, you can find that it's sometimes possible for you to make considerable inroads without defeating capitalism. Capitalism has an absorptive capacity. For example, let's take the women's oppression. Women's oppression is older than class oppression. When it is older than class, we as Marxists thought that if there is going to be a decline in the oppression of women in terms of income and wealth, for example, differences between income and wealth of men and women here, that this is necessarily going to mean a decline in class oppression. What has actually happened? There has been a decline within the class, within the middle class, within the lower class, within the upper class, between the incomes and wealth differentiation between men and women. But class oppression has actually increased. In other words, capitalism also has a certain flexibility with regard to the question of these various oppressions here that enables us to cope and survive here. So you have to put, at the same time, it is not by saying that everybody must give up their activism in this particular area or network. You fight where you feel best capable of fighting. But recognize the importance of linking that to struggles which are taking place against capitalism and those who are struggling against them, even as you become the most loyal and militant struggles. And for God's sakes, we have to have a much more democratic left forces in their relationship between the movement, because in India, I can tell you that movements have behaved badly with regard to your left parties, but the left parties have behaved worse with the movements. They have not even acted as the tribunes of these oppressed groups within parliament. So it's not entirely surprising that many of these movements have just got fed up with the existing left, which about it. And this comes, if you like, not just from the question of Stalinism, but let's understand that the legacy of Bolshevism, which is most democratic, because even Trotsky, Lenin later on made very serious mistakes, and Trotsky also made mistakes, but you had a period of Bolshevism which was the most democratic internal organizations. And one of the strengths of the Fourth International is that as compared to all other radical left organizations, it does recognize this to a much greater extent. But we have to keep on fighting to internally democratize left groups, and also, of course, to democratize and show the relationship with other organizations. But I've given you a kind of long-winded answer as to why I think that the network of networks approach doesn't work. Let me say one thing about Canada and the United States, that as I mentioned earlier, because there are immigrant societies, there's a greater openness than is the case in Sri Lanka or India here. Let me give you a story, which I hope you don't mind. Some years ago, Trudeau and Obama met at an industrial trade fair. And in the corner, there was a machine that could tell the future 50 years from now. So Trudeau asked Obama, type into the machine and tell us what the United States will look like 50 years from now. So Obama typed in, a big piece of paper came out. Trudeau said, read it. So Obama read it and said, America is very prosperous. It's very fine, democratic. And the president of the United States is Miguel Velasquez Sanchez. And the vice president is Chow Ho Fung. And Chinese is compulsory in all schools. Then Obama asked Trudeau, why don't you type into this machine and tell us what Canada will be like 50 years from now? So Trudeau types into the machine, a big piece of paper comes out, and Obama says to Trudeau, read it. And Trudeau says, how can I? It's in Punjabi. But what's my point? You have 4 Sikhs in the cabinet in the United States, including the Minister of Defense. Huh? I'm not saying that everything is great in Canada, the way you treat First Nations, all sorts of things, problems here. But there is a relative openness here and flexibility there that is not there even in these societies like in India and elsewhere, etc. We're fighting. So, of course, the fight takes place everywhere to make democratize. But I just thought that I would share that with you. Huh?
Yeah, Ridley has a question, I think.
Oh, Ridley.
Yeah, right. I don't know how to address you.
Achin.
Achin? Okay.
Achin is fine, yes.
Right. Okay. Achin. Right. I have a problem with your I think with your presentation with the concept of democratic nationalism. I don't know if you are a nationalist, you could be democratic. I'm a Sri Lankan now living in England. I'm not a nationalist. I'm a Democrat. I believe I'm a socialist, communist. So there is a sort of oxymoronic concept. I think if you are a Democrat, you couldn't be a nationalist. If you are a nationalist and you want to be democratic within being a nationalist, then you're talking about your nation. For example, Sinhala or Tamil, whatever. And if you're going to be democratic, then I think you've got to be internationalist, not nationalist. But I'm okay with living with contradictions and also a democratic nationalist in terms of, say, in the past, like in the imperial stage, like when Lenin talked about imperialism, right? Democracy was valid in fighting against imperialism, and now today in the 21st century, do have imperial zones, not an imperialism as such.
Okay.
Within one power, right?
Okay.
So that is one of my questions. And the other thing is, when you talk about secularization, there is also the other aspect of secularization, which is non-secularization. If you're sort of talking about sort of the dialectic or in Hegelian sense. So what is non-secularization within communalism, within nationalism, and how do you address this question of contradiction to the secularization and the non-secularization and the politicalization of secularization or the non-secularization? When you talk about Islamic fundamentalism or Sinhala Buddhism or Hinduism in India. So these are contradictions I'm struggling with. I hope you could give some explanation to me.
Let me take this question of non-secularization first. I thought I'd already tried to make that clear in terms of public religiosity. And of course, non-secularization means the significant influence of religious personnel, beliefs, values, and beliefs and values and institutions in civil society. Liberation theology you put to one side. But is this something which is good? And I've said no. And I've said that the dialectic is that if you try to force secularization, like the examples I gave, it doesn't help. It in fact reinforces that, because what happens is that the banner of religion is taken up in the fight against these these dictatorships, this lack of democracy right? But non-secularization and inclusion is also anti-democratic, even as it tries to cover it up here. But what is the reason why non-secularization actually grows? And my answer to this has a lot more to do with politics than it has to do with the question of culture. Huh? If you look at even the Islamic world, please note that the one part of the world which has not had any movement towards procedural democracy, as compared to, say, even some of the African states, sub-Saharan African states, has been the Middle East, North Africa. That's one here. That connected to the question of here. At the same time, you must also recognize that in the period after independence, the anti-imperialist struggle, decolonization, the dominant forces in what much of the Islamic world were secular forces. Not necessarily socialist, but there were socialist forces, there was Nasirism, there was Baathism, and there were in fact communist parties and forces, etc. The rise of Islamic forces and of Islamic religio-political movements is also strongly connected to the success of imperialism and others in finishing off these secular movements of various kinds here, so that they actually stepped in as well. So yes, it's something that's very dangerous. We have to fight against it. But my sense is that we'll have to fight against it at the political, material level to a much greater extent. Yes, at the cultural level as well, the question of rationalization and all that. So yes, non-secularization has grown. And it has grown this vacuum. And I thought that what I presented here in terms of why it has been able to grow here is an explanation here. And because it's due to multiple factors, we have to address those multiple factors as well in order to move towards a greater degree of secularization of society here. How does it come about? Well, that depends on the kind of movements you take, which address, if you like, struggles across faiths. In the Indian context, when we had the CAA, the Citizen Amendment Act, which is clearly directed against Muslims, why do you think the Modi government has come out against it? Because something very unusual happened for the first time in India since independence. One, you had a huge mobilization of Muslim women, not in the name of Islam, but against that in the name of the Constitution and of upholding the Constitution and of being Indians, not by Muslim women. You also had, for the first time in metropolitan areas, young people, many of the age category which supported Modi to a greater extent than other age categories in the general elections. In the urban areas, you had young people across faiths coming to the support of the against the CAA. It's as if they recognize the importance of democracy and the democratic elements within the Indian Constitution, even as it's got certain bad elements as well. Incidentally, on the question of both nationalism, which I'll come to, and on the question of the Constitution, my latest book has a detailed understanding about that. So there on the question of non-secularization, obviously it's a worry, but it's something which has been reversed to a certain extent, but it's something that will also go down. Please note that the authoritarian nationalism in France is in the name of civic nationalism. It's not so much a non-secularization, but in fact a defense of laicite, which has moved in the direction of Islamophobia. So it's not so much a non-secularization there as an excessive attack on Islamophobia, except over here. The United States is different from Britain, where Britain, in fact, has a more relaxed attitude towards than even France with regard to different religious communities and so on here. I won't go into the differences here, but it reinforces the point that even when you talk about non-secularization, you will have to look at the specific histories of different national and regional areas, etc. And then come to even as non-secularization or the religious resurgence is something that is more general and widespread here. Let me come to the question of nationalism that you raised and the query that you raised about democratic nationalism.
Yeah, we are running out of time. Another 5 minutes.
I'll just finally put on that over here. Look,
Okay.
Nationalism, I've explained, is stronger. Marxists were wrong, whether Lenin, Marx and all, in failing to recognize the durability of nationalism. They didn't understand that over here. Am I for democratic nationalism? I've already said that we must go beyond it. Yes, and I'm also aware of the problem here in one sentence. There are limits to how progressive nationalism can be. There are no limits to how reactionary it can be. This is very, very important to understand. But how we fight for internationalism and how we fight against that is something that will have to be mediated through the struggle for a better nationalism, even as we have to say that we have to go beyond it. In fact, Lenin said something very important. He said, class before nation, and nation and class against nation. Your point about that is well taken. But unlike Marx's vision of workers of the world unite, we are living in a world today in which, unlike in the 19th century and in the early 20th or the mid 20th century, the banner of internationalism was then held by the leftists. Today, the banner of internationalism is being held by the rightists, neoliberal globalization. Their slogan is elites and upper classes of the world unite. You have nothing to lose, certainly not your privileges. We have to fight against that. But remember what Marx also said. In order for us to be internationalists, we have to come to terms with our own bourgeoisie. And I don't believe that there is a transnational capitalist class. I believe that there is a capitalist class is connected to their areas here. I can't develop that particular point. But you have certain Marxists who talk about a transnational capitalist class. I don't believe that, although they operate obviously transnationally in various ways over here. So yes, my answer to you would be yes and no. I hope I made myself clear, but that doesn't mean that you should agree with me, of course. I find many people who are not prepared to agree with me on anything that I say, but that's a different matter.
Time is out. Any other? You have a question, Ridley? Do you have a question? Ridley?
His mic is mute, I think.
Okay, Professor, now would you agree, Achin or Professor
Achin, yeah, fine.
That it is now a question of fighting, struggling for universals like justice, equality, solidarity, brotherhood, like universal concepts. It is now in the 21st century. Would you agree that it is a question of fighting for universal values?
Of course, we have to fight for universal values, but let's remember one thing. We believe in universal humanity, but the only way that you can be a human being, you can be a human being universally, is by being a particular human being. We have to recognize that. We are divided by class, we're divided by nation, we're divided by so many of these things here. We have to recognize this particularity and use these particularities to make it different and to move towards the universality, etc. In other words, again, not counterposing the university to particularity, but recognizing the different kinds of particularities and the ones that we have to use to precisely move in that particular direction. There could be, and I could elaborate on this particular point here, but that's a different.
I think we have to stop now. I can give another person chance, 2 minutes, kind of.
Can I read a question? Debarati has a question here, but it's a long question. Debarati, she has a question. She posted a question in chat. She asked the question, what do you think can be the strategic practice of resistance today in India to combat the right wing, which has managed to criminalize all kind of progressive resistance to the regime?
It's a long-term struggle. I've already pointed out what I have to say here with regard. Different people are fighting at different levels. We have to build a new kind of a left, which is very much within the tradition of the best of the Bolshevik tradition, because there were also bad things about the Bolshevik tradition here. And that means building cadres through ideology and activism in a long-term way. That's our key that we have to concentrate on. Anyway, and I'm glad that you have this kind of Zoom thing, but activism were important. And I hope that I've been able to be of some help and insights in what I've said.
Okay, we'll stop here. Do you have a question?
As a suggestion, can we have another session with Professor Achin? Is it possible?
Yeah, I'm prepared to talk on any number of issues. You know, most Indians love to talk. I'm not different from that here.
Actually, I mean, personally,
that's a particularity of many Indians.
Personally, I had so many questions about the activism and also the building.
Okay, I will contact you and fix a date.
Yeah.
But actually, on the question of activism, what I generally said that over here, if you have some questions on, say, Marxism and ecology, or the question of fascism, on which I've written here, and others, that I think would be an area, or even the Marxist approach to history or something like that, I could be of perhaps a wider interest.
Well, I think we can take a more concrete issue, how to organize the working class, that kind of questions.
Okay.
Then some of our comrades can also contribute to the
discussion. I think
so
that will be better.
I will write to you and fix a time with you.
And I would suggest there, because I'm 73, is that you also have a certain panel of discussion, including people who are actively involved in a more regular way than I am. Much of I'm involved, of course, in civil liberties, and I'm involved in the anti-nuclear movement and so on, and of course on intellectual work. But it'd be great to have a panel in which both in Sri Lanka and India, you have people who are actually rooted in various struggles.
I think most of the participants are activists actually.
And I can definitely suggest comrades who are more actively involved in grassroots work in India as part of our group.
Okay.
I think it is now more, I mean, in the early days, like in the Samaja Party days, there were sort of more close relations with India, Filipino and Peru, Kolingari Silva, and so on. Bolshevik Party was a branch of Indian, the section. But now, today, it is neoliberalism that has sort of got hold of Sri Lanka and India together. So in the left need to revive and reconnect with Indian leftists and fight the South Indian within in
I
South
think
India.
that is one of the purpose of Marx School English version.
Yeah.
To invite people from at least from South Asia and Southeast Asia to have some kind of discourse on common issues. That's what we are going to do. So thank you very much, Achin, for your excellent presentation and also your answers and comments on the questions. And we will meet soon in another day. I will contact you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the again. And I thank all the Indian comrades who came, and also the Philippine comrades who came to this session. And thanks all of you. And have a good night. I think for Raghu, good morning, and Palpa. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sebenarnya ada mungkin ada pertanyaan workshop itu mungkin වෙනවද?
ඔව් ඒක මේ නීල් විස්තරය වයෝට. ඒකට අනුව කටයුතු කරමු.